So this topic actually follows on very well from the concept of a truth commission and truth-telling. There's a little bit of a handout with some of the journey that Australia's currently undergoing in terms of our own reconciliation journey with our Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So much of this journey is about the concept of truth-telling. It's at a time when truth is being challenged, the truth of our own history, the truth about the impacts of that history, and the current efforts to address those, the past wrongs and current challenges. And we're facing a lot of divisive misinformation and disinformation as part of our journey. Disinformation campaigns designed to undermine a democratic process. But I'm going to be talking about the past significant milestone of when our Australian government said sorry for past wrongs, and an event that's about to occur in 2 weeks when we're going to vote on a referendum to embed in our constitution recognition of a disadvantaged community and provide them with a voice. So this pathway of reconciliation has been going on for about the last decade and a half, and the next step, as I said, will occur on the 14th of October. And it's a reconciliation that's focused really on about rebuilding a relationship between our First Nation communities, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the non-Indigenous community. And it's really about trying to address disadvantage and division. And it goes back to the comments said earlier today. It's about recognising the past wrongs, actually taking the facts of our history and telling the truth, accepting that responsibility for those past wrongs as a government. And we're talking about wrongs that occurred in the 1930s right through to the 1970s. So they're historical wrongs. They're not the current generation, but you've got a current generation wanting to apologise and then decide what we do about that, and then reconciling that through genuine dialogue. And the truth-telling really has been imposed on past governments because it's contributed to displacement, dispossession, racism and equality. Now the two terms that I've used, displacement and dispossession, are very familiar to Cypriots. A lot of those people that I come across have had historical family injustices. They're concepts that Cypriots understand and they're continuing to experience. The difference for Australian Indigenous communities is that spiritual disconnect from country. It's not just physical. It's not your village. It's not your home. It's actually your ancestral identity and the storytelling and taking on board the 55,000 years of your ancestors and the storylines and the song lines and the dreamtime stories that go with that. So it's actually quite an intangible concept that Western sort of modern democratic societies don't necessarily grasp. So it's not just physical, it's actually spiritual and cultural. But the consequences are the same as we've seen in Cyprus from the displacement and dispossession. Intergenerational trauma associated with that dispossession and displacement. And that started, for many, it started in 1788 when Captain Cook, a British explorer, landed in Botany Bay. And for some, it started in the 1930s when the government of the time imposed a policy that removed Aboriginal children from their parents and institutionalised them, and that continued right through the 30s. It was a bit about changing the identity of that population, breeding out the blacks, as they say. But again, it contributed to displacement, disadvantage and not being heard. So you've got multiple generations of Indigenous people that were removed from their parents and want to tell their story. So it's about not forgetting the past, but actually how do you reconcile that journey? So it's focusing on the future. And as we've matured as a nation, as Australia has developed its own identity, it started to take a good look at itself in the mirror and look at our history. Now, for many, for a long time, the story of those stolen generation of children wasn't really discussed. It wasn't taught to me as a child when I was going through school as a young child 40 years ago. But it's increasingly becoming part of the dialogue of the modern Australia. And there's a growing awareness of the impact of those past policies. And it's not easy. So we've got a generation of politicians that have to acknowledge that the past policies of the government were wrong, have contributed significantly to intergenerational trauma. And that truth-telling is confronting, but acknowledging those historical wrongs is so important to take the next step. And we're not talking about changing history to suit a narrative. We're talking about just telling the history and giving an opportunity. And that started in 1995 on the handout. I've talked about the National Inquiry into Separation of Aboriginal Children. And that was the first comprehensive government report or inquiry into the impact of that policy between 1930 and the 1970s. But then it was followed by the response, the actual inquiry report and the recommendations. And that started a generation in the late 90s of a generation of people calling for apology, a national apology. And that finally occurred when we had a government change in 2008. I don't know if any of you watched the Olympics in 2000, the finale concert. We had our Midnight Oil, one of our prominent bands, wear sorry T-shirts, and that was really indicative of the generational change that we were seeing. It took a long time, over 10 years, to get a government to say sorry. And that sorry was a national apology, and most high commissions and ambassadors' residents have that formally displayed. It's almost as important as our constitution for many. That occurred in 2008. That was the first major step after those inquiries into our reconciliation journey. But what came with that apology was recommendations of what do you do about it? So you've acknowledged it publicly, so what are you going to do about it? And that came with some recommendations and some initiatives trying to close the gaps, as they say, because that apology was about a disadvantaged community where they've got higher rates of incarceration, poorer health outcomes, lower education outcomes, disadvantage and intergenerational trauma that's contributing to all of those. So they said, we're going to have to do something about it. And that was in 2008. And then between now and then, the governments have been trying to address it, but not making much progress. And that's very much led to the current state of where we are after the apology of looking at, well, if it's not working, what are we going to do? And so those Indigenous communities got together in 2014, we've got over 240 clans, Indigenous clans in Australia, but the leaders of those communities started to come together and say, well, you're not addressing those inequities, those disadvantages. It's not working. There's a lot of money being pumped into those initiatives, but it's not working. Was that because we weren't listening? Possibly. The government thought it knew what was best for those communities. And as a result, between 2014 and 2017, those communities got together and said, look, we need to be consulted on policies that impact us. Very simple concept. And in 2017, they produced the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And that really was a point in time when they said, we want to be consulted. We want to be heard. We want to have input to the policies and help manage and take responsibility for ourselves. And that was quite a significant document that has led to the current step where we are of a voice, a referendum changing our constitution to embed in our constitution a mechanism for consultation. It's an advisory body that when policies are developed for that disadvantaged community, they are actually consulted on that policy, a very simple concept. So they wanted a voice. So we'd had the apology, we've had the truth-telling, and now they wanted a mechanism to be consulted. Now, past governments have set up institutions and entities for consultation with that Indigenous community. We've had 3 different forms of national Indigenous consultation communities and commissions. But as with so many things, governments can abolish things when they don't like what they're hearing. So this community is saying, you've set up commissions in the past to listen to us, but when you don't like what you're hearing, or it's one side of, perhaps one colour of government says, we'll elect you if you get rid of this because it's impacting on our ability to mine, or our land rights, or our environmental agendas, we'll get rid of it. So what they want is an enshrined voice, an enshrined mechanism to be consulted. in our constitution, and it can't be abolished by a government of the day or future government. Very simple concept. And on the 14th of October, we're about to vote on that. All Australians vote. We have compulsory voting. But it's become a very divisive agenda, very divisive campaign. It goes back to that misinformation and truth-telling, truth about what you're actually voting on. Some of the communities are saying we're voting on an entity that will abolish our national holiday, will change the taxation arrangement. You won't be able to access your backyard. That's not what the case is. It's purely an advisory committee. But the disinformation and the misinformation that's been accompanying that has been challenging. It is continuing to be challenging, and we've got 2 weeks left before we have to vote. But it goes back to that truth, the concept of truth and truth-telling, and how it can be politicised and lead to a lot of pain and hurt. And it's been a very difficult journey that we're about to take. But I do encourage that most Australians, all Australians will vote, I'm sure. If they don't, they get fined. But it's quite a significant journey, step in our reconciliation journey. Will it be successful? It's hard to say, and it's not for me to tell people how to vote. It's for me to ask you to vote and consider what you want for our future of that disadvantaged community be. So it's a common thing. The commonalities I'm seeing here in Cyprus are dispossession and displacement. The history that goes with that, are we being truthful about that displacement and dispossession and the impacts of that policy? Are we willing to say sorry? And then once we've said sorry, what are we going to do about it? And are we genuinely having a conversation and dialogue? So it's a very simple concept, not always easy. And I do hope, personally, that the vote on the 14th of October will lead to a change in constitution to acknowledge our First Nation communities and give them a voice. It's a voice, it's advisory. The executive government of ARM will still make those policies and decisions. But we can only hope. And look, I just want to put a thank you to the Australians that have come 14,000 kilometres to be here today, who are bi-communal. We've got a Turkish Cypriot and a Greek Cypriot Australian who are walking across the island. They walked across the island in 2018 in the spirit of peace, and they're doing it again. So thank you for coming all this way to hear my talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Most of you won't be voting, unfortunately, but some are. No questions? I'll take one from Alexandra and then one from Yeltsin.
You mentioned about the task being the closing of the gap. How much has this been closed in a way? How much the two sides have come?
So the recommendations to address the disadvantages in this community, which is about 3% of our population, 3 to 4%, started in 2008. And it's a bit like SDG targets, the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got about, I think it's 14 targets. We haven't made a lot of progress. I can't tell you the most current assessment, but I think we made progress on about 4. We are still seeing significant incarceration. So our dominant population in our prisons is our Indigenous community, but that's coming from intergenerational trauma, where you've got multiple generations that have been perhaps not had proper parenting because they've been institutionalised, and as a result they don't necessarily have parenting skills, and so that flows on to education and health opportunities. And you know, disadvantaged communities, they've got whole communities that are facing those sorts of challenges. So incarceration, health, they've got a shorter life expectancy. They have some unique health challenges in the remote communities, dialysis, rheumatoid heart issues, and they're endemic across those communities. So we're not seeing a lot of progress against the targets. It's not for lack of trying, but often it's those communities saying, we know what's best for us to try and address those challenges, and that's what the voice is about, giving them more of a role in addressing their own issues. Very simple concept.
Thank you.
Yeltsin?
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks for introducing Stavros and I as well. Stavros and I walked 400 plus kilometres across Cyprus, and we've been through our own personal reconciliation, rapprochement process, if you like, and it is a long one, and certainly incredibly valuable to us. I do have a question, Fiona, regarding the voice itself and how, and more broadly the Uluru Statement from the Heart, how it was developed from a grassroots level, giving people a voice, I suppose, in the community level, and how that might apply in Cyprus, especially, I suppose, maybe cutting through some of the politics and giving people on the ground a voice.
Thanks, Yasin. That Uluru Statement to the Heart had various elements, truth, treaty and voice. So the truth telling about the history, treaty making, which is about recognising and giving a status to those community, and then the voice, which is about consultation on policies and impact of them. It was a 3-year process, and it was grassroots driven. So we had the diverse communities right across Australia. 250 leaders came together ultimately at the end of that process, and they negotiated that statement, Uluru. It's a 1-page document. It's quite moving when you read it, and you can Google it readily on the internet. But it was a negotiation process amongst those communities, and it's not one community. It's quite a diverse community. Some are urbanised, most are not. They come from different parts of Australia, and like any federation, we have, the West Coast versus East Coast versus the remote regional Northern Australians. So it's not one community, but it was a consultation and negotiation process to get there. But it represented the community's view, and that was acknowledged by the government. They said, we understand that this is the view of that Indigenous community right across Australia. Now, that in itself, I think, was quite a significant step, because governments will choose whether they accept a view or not. They may say that's not the community's view. We are seeing, as part of the discussion, the campaigns, the No campaign and the Yes campaign, in support and not support of the referendum, that division starting to come through. Some of our Indigenous communities are saying it doesn't represent my view. But I think that's more of the division and the undermining of the campaigns and that divisive misinformation, that when people feel they're not getting everything they want, it's a all in or all out type mentality. That doesn't work. You need compromise. You need the dialogue to come up with that discussion and compromise. And often I see that's one of the challenges on this island, are people willing to compromise. And that transactional approach that I see on this island, if I can't give something without getting something, but that's a challenging environment to operate in. I don't think it's realistic anymore. I think you're going to have to compromise and give for the greater good, not for your individual need, but for the greater community good. And I think that's where some of the parallels come in with Cyprus.
Question.
Quick question, practical. How could we combine through the Commonwealth between Cyprus and Australia to get the sorry gay message and the voice message across?
I would say many Commonwealth countries are going through a bit of a hard look at themselves. They're considering whether they want to be part of that community. And often that's based in history. So we're seeing a huge movement across the Caribbean related to slavery and wanting to have that story told. In terms of Cyprus and Australia, the fundamental principles of the Commonwealth are democratic, human rights, a greater focus on that. I don't know what your perspective is on whether Cyprus is a strong advocate of Commonwealth values. I think they're a member, but I don't necessarily see them always being promulgated as perhaps I would like to see them.